Hi, and thank you so much for joining us again with the Giving Project for Children. Today we're going to continue our read aloud of Charlotte Webb, and I'm so excited to continue to share with you. When we last left off, we had read chapter 1, so if you haven't read that with us, go back and check that out on our YouTube page, or you can go back, scroll through our posts and see it. And where we had finished, Fern was nursing little baby Wilbur. Cute little baby Wilbur, that little sweet little pig. And we're about to start chapter 2 now. Today we're going to read chapters 2, 3, and 4, and each Thursday we'll read a few chapters. Today I want you to really think about this strategy called prediction. When we predict as a reader, we think ahead about what is going to happen. So what I want you to do today as a reader, and there's going to be a couple of times where I stop you and I ask you to think ahead to what's going to happen. But what I want you to do right now is, if you think about where we just left off, and she said his name is Wilbur, and she's in class, and she's thinking about how wonderful it's going to be to have this sweet little pig. I want you to predict or think ahead about what's going to happen. And let's start chapter 2, Wilbur. Again, there are not a lot of illustrations in here, but the illustrations are by Garth Williams and they're beautiful. So whenever we do come to an illustration, I'll be sure to stop and show it to you. Wilbur. Fern loved Wilbur more than anything. She loved to stroke him, to feed him, to put him to bed. Every morning, as soon as she got up, she warmed his milk, tied his bib on, and held the bottle for him. Every afternoon, when the bus stopped in front of the house, she jumped out and ran to the kitchen to fix another bottle for him. She fed him again at supper time and again just before going to bed. Mrs. Arable gave him a feeding around noontime each day when Fern was away at school. Wilbur, he loved his milk, and he was never happier than when Fern was warming up a bottle for him. He would stand and gaze at her with adoring eyes. What do you think adoring eyes means? Well, it obviously means that he's watching her somehow, right? Adoring. To adore means to love or to show some sort of affection. So when he's looking up at her with adoring eyes, he's looking at her, showing her how much he loves her already. And they just got to know each other. I can't wait to watch that relationship develop. For the first few days of life, Wilbur was allowed to live in a box near the stove in the kitchen. Wow, he could live in the kitchen? I'm surprised Mrs. Arable allowed that. Then, when Mrs. Arable complained, I see this, he was moved to a bigger box in the woodshed. About at 2 weeks of age, he was moved outdoors. It was apple blossom time, and the days were getting warmer. Mr. Arable fixed a small yard specifically for Wilbur underneath an apple tree and gave him a large wooden box full of straw with a doorway cut in it so he could walk in and out as he pleased. "Won't he be cold at night?" asked Fern. "No," said her father. "You watch and you see how he does." Carrying a bottle of milk, Fern sat down under an apple tree inside the yard. Look at that cute little pig. Wilbur ran to her, and she held the bottle for him while he sucked. When he had finished the last drop, he grunted and walked sleepily into the box. What do you think that grunt sounded like? My little kiddo likes to do piggy sounds, and he likes to do them like. But I wonder if that's exactly what a real piggy sounds like, especially a little tiny one. Fern peered through the door. Wilbur was poking the straw with his snout, and in a short time, he had dug a tunnel in the straw with his snout. He crawled into the tunnel and disappeared from sight, completely covered with straw. Fern was enchanted. It relieved her mind to know that her baby would sleep covered up, and he would stay warm. Every morning after breakfast, Wilbur walked out to the road with Fern and waited with her until the bus came. She would wave goodbye to him, and he would stand and watch the bus until it vanished around the turn. When Fern was in school, Wilbur was shut up inside his yard. But as soon as she got home in the afternoon, he would take him out and he would follow her around the place. If she went into the house, Wilbur went too. If she went upstairs, Wilbur would wait at the bottom of the stairs until she came down again. If she took her doll for a walk in the doll carriage, what do you think would happen? Look. She took Wilbur in the doll cage with the doll. Oh my goodness, she's so cute. Sometimes on these journeys, Wilbur would get tired, and Fern would pick him up and put him in the carriage alongside the doll. He liked this. And if he was very tired, he would close his eyes and go to sleep under the doll's blanket. He looked cute when his eyes were closed. And the doll would close her eyes too, and Fern would wheel the carriage very slowly and smoothly so as not to wake her infants. One warm afternoon, Fern and Avery put on bathing suits and went down to the brook for a swim. Wilbur tagged along at Fern's heels, and when she waded into the brook, Wilbur waded in with her. He found the water quite cold, too cold for his liking. So while the children swam and played and splashed in the water at each other, Wilbur amused himself in the mud along the edge of the brook, where it was warm and moist and delightfully sticky and cozy. Every day was a happy day, and every night was peaceful. Wilbur was what farmers call a spring pig, which simply means he was born in the springtime. Pretty obvious. When he was 5 weeks old, Mr. Arable said he was now big enough to sell and would have to be sold. Fern broke down and wept, but her father was firm about it. Wilbur's appetite had increased, and he was beginning to eat scraps of food in addition to milk. Mr. Arable was not willing to provide for him any longer, and he had already sold Wilbur's 10 brothers and sisters. "He's got to go," he said. "You have had your fun raising a baby pig, but Wilbur is not a baby any longer, and he has to be sold." "How about calling up the Zuckermans?" suggested Mrs. Arable to Fern. "Your Uncle Homer sometimes raises pigs, and if Wilbur goes there to live, you can walk down the road and visit him as often as you like." How much money should I ask for him?" Fern wanted to know. "Well, he's a runt," said her father, "so tell your Uncle Homer you've got a pig to sell for $6 and see what he says." And it was soon arranged. Fern phoned and got her Aunt Edith, and her Aunt Edith hollered for Uncle Homer, and Uncle Homer came in from the barn and talked to Fern. And when he heard that the price was only $6, he said he would buy that pig. Next day, Wilbur was taken from his home under the apple tree and went to live in a manure pile in the cellar of Zuckerman's barn. That is the end of chapter 2. Did your predictions come true? Chapter 3 is called Escape. So now I want you to make a prediction about what happens in chapter 2, or chapter 3, Escape. Who escapes? Where do they escape to? The barn was very large. This is obviously Zuckerman's barn. It was very old, and it smelled of hay, and it smelled a lot of manure. It smelled of perspiration of tired horses and the wonderful sweet breath of patient cows. It often had a sort of peaceful smell, as though nothing bad could happen ever again in the world. It smelled of grain and of harness dressing and of axle grease and of rubber boots and of a new rope, and whenever the cat was given a fish head to eat, the barn would smell like fish. But mostly it smelled like hay, for there was always hay in the great loft up overhead, and there was always hay being pitched down to the cows and the horses and the sheep. The barn was pleasantly warm in winter when the animals spent most of their time indoors, and it was pleasantly cool in summer with the big doors stood open wide to the breeze. The barn had stalls on the main floor for the work horses, tie-ups on the main floors for the cows, a sheepfold down below for sheep, a pig pen down below for Wilbur, and it was full of all sorts of things that you find in barns. Ladders, grindstones, pitchforks, monkey wrenches, scythes, lawnmowers, show shovels, axe handles, milk pails, water buckets, empty grain sacks, and rusty rat traps. It was the kind of barn that swallows like to build their nests in. It was the kind of barn that children like to play in. And the whole thing was owned by Fern's uncle, Mr. Homer L. Zuckerman. Wilbur's new home was in the lower part of the barn, directly underneath the cows. Mr. Zuckerman knew that a manure pile is a good place to keep a young pig. Manure is like animal poop. Would that be where you want to stay? I wouldn't want to stay there. But I think Wilbur's going to be really happy. Pigs need warmth, and it's warm and comfortable down there in the manure pile, in the barn cellar on the south side. Fern came almost every day to visit him. She found an old milking stool that had been discarded, and she placed the stool in the sheepfold next to Wilbur's pen. Here she sat quietly during long afternoons, thinking and listening and watching Wilbur. The sheep soon got to know her and trust her. So did the geese who lived with the sheep, and the animals trusted her. She was so quiet and so friendly. Mr. Zuckerman did not allow her to take Wilbur out, and he did not allow her to get in the pig pen. But he told Fern that she could sit on that stool and watch Wilbur as long as she wanted. It made her happy to be just near the pigs, and it made Wilbur happy to know that she was sitting there right outside his pen. But he never had any fun. No walks, no rides, no swims. One afternoon in June, when Wilbur was almost 2 months old, he wandered out of his small yard outside the barn. Fern had not yet arrived for her usual visit, and Wilbur stood in the sun feeling lonely and bored. "There's never anything to do around here," he thought, and he walked slowly to his food trough and sniffed to see if anything had been overlooked at lunch. He found a small strip of a potato skin and he ate it. His back itched, so he leaned against the fence and rubbed his back along the boards. And when he tired of this, he walked indoors, climbed to the top of the manure pile, and sat. He didn't feel like going to sleep. He didn't feel like digging, and he was tired of standing still and really tired of lying down. "I'm less than 2 months old, and I'm tired of living," he said, and he walked out to the yard again. "When I'm out of here," he said, "there's no place to go but in. And when I'm indoors, there's no place to go but out in the yard." But then someone spoke. "That's where you're wrong, my friend," said a voice. Wilbur looked through the fence and saw the goose standing there. "You don't have to stay in that dirty little yard," said the goose, who talked rather fast. "One of the boards is loose. Push on it. Push, 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 push. Come on over." "What?" says Wilbur. "Say it slower." At the risk of repeating myself," said the goose, "I suggest that you come on out. It's wonderful out here." Did you say a board was loose?" That I did, said the goose. And Wilbur walked up to the fence and saw that the goose was right. One board was loose. Let's pause here for a second and let's make another prediction. What do you think is going to happen? We know that Wilbur's bored. We know that there's a board loose. And we know that that goose is trying to coax him out. I'm thinking that this is not a good idea. But I'm also thinking and predicting that Wilbur is going to do it. Let's see what happens. He put his head down, shut his eyes, and pushed. The board gave way. And in a minute, he'd squeezed through the fence and was standing on the long grass outside his yard, and the goose chuckled. "How does it feel to be free?" she asked. I like it," said Wilbur. "That is, I guess I like it." Actually, Wilbur felt quite queer to be on the outside of the fence, with nothing between him and the big world. "Where do you think I'd better go?" Anywhere you like, said the goose. "Go down through the orchard, root up the sod, go down to the garden, dig up the radishes, root up everything. Eat grass, look for corn, look for oats, run all over, skip and dance and jump and prance. Go down to the orchard and stroll in the woods. The woods are a wonderful place when you're young." I can see that," replied Wilbur. And he gave a jump in the air, twirled, and ran a few steps, stopped, looked all around, sniffed the smells of the afternoon, and then set off walking down the path to the orchard. Pausing in the shade of the apple tree, he put his strong snout to the ground and began pushing, digging, rooting. He felt very, very happy. He had plowed quite a piece of ground before anyone had noticed him. Mrs. Zuckerman was the first to see him. She saw him from the kitchen window, and she immediately shouted for the men. "Homer!" she cried. "Pigs out! Larvae! Pigs out! Homer! Larvae! Pigs out! He's down there under the apple tree!" Now the trouble starts, thought Wilbur. "Now I'll catch it." And the goose heard the racket, and she too started hollering. Run downhill! Make for the woods! She shouted to Wilbur. "They'll never catch you." Cocker Spaniel heard the commotion, and he ran out from the barn to join the chase. Mr. Zuckerman heard, and he came out of the machine shed where he was mending a tool. Lurvy, the hired hand, heard, and he came out from the asparagus patch where he was pulling weeds. Everybody walked towards Wilbur, and Wilbur didn't know what to do. The woods seemed a long way off, and anyway, he'd never been down there, and the woods, he wasn't really sure he would like it. "Get out behind him, Lurvy," said Mr. Zuckerman, "and drive him toward the barn. Take it easy. Don't rush him. I'll go back and get a bucket of slops." The news of Wilbur's escape spread rapidly among the animals in the place. And whenever any creature broke loose on Zuckerman's farm, the event was of great interest to the others. The goose shouted to the nearest cow that Wilbur was free, and soon all the cows knew. Then one of the cows told one of the sheep, and soon all the sheep knew. The lambs learned about it from their mothers, and the horses in their stall in the barn pricked up their ears when they heard the goose hollering. And soon the horses had caught on to what was happening. "Wilbur's out," they said. Every animal stirred and lifted its head and became excited to know that one of his friends had gotten free and was no longer penned up and tied fast. Wilbur didn't know what to do or which way to run. It seemed as though everybody was after him. "If this is what it's like to be free," he thought, "I believe I'd rather be penned up in my own yard." The Cocker Spaniel was sneaking up on him from one side. Lurvy, the hired hand, was sneaking up on him from the other side. Mrs. Zuckerman, she stood ready to get him off if he went into the garden. And now Mr. Zuckerman was coming down for him too, carrying a pail.
"This is really awful," thought Wilbur. "Why doesn't Fern come?"
And he began to cry. The pig began to cry. I wonder what that sounds like. I'm predicting. Do you think that Wilbur will get away? Or do you think that they're going to get him? From what I know about animals and what I know about people, I think that they're going to get Wilbur back in his pen. But let's go back and let's read and see what happens. The goose took command and began to give orders. "Don't just stand there, Wilbur. Dodge about, cried the goose. "Skip around, run, towards, in and out, twist and turn, make for the woods." The Cocker Spaniel sprang for Wilbur's hind legs, and Wilbur jumped, and he ran. Lurvy reached out and grabbed. Mrs. Zuckerman screamed at Lurvy. The goose cheered for Wilbur. Wilbur dodged between Lurvy's legs. Lurvy missed Wilbur and grabbed the spaniel instead. Nicely done, said the goose. Try it again.
"Run downhill," suggested one of the cows.
"Run uphill," cried the gander.
"Run uphill,"
cried the sheep. "Twist and turn," honked the goose. "Jump and dance," said the rooster.
"Look out for Lurvy,"
called the cows. "Look out for Zuckerman," yelled the gander.
"Watch for the dogs."
Listen to me, said the goose. Poor Wilbur was dazed and frightened by all this hullabaloo, and he didn't like being the center of all this fuss. He tried to follow the instructions of his friends, but he couldn't run downhill and uphill at the same time, and he couldn't twist and turn when he was jumping and dancing. And he was crying so hard, he could barely see anything that was happening. After all, Wilbur was a very young pig, not much more than a baby, really, and he wished Fern were there to take him in his arms and comfort him. When he looked up and saw that Mr. Zuckerman was standing quite close to him, holding a pail of warm slops, he felt relieved. He lifted his nose and he sniffed. The smell was delicious. Warm milk, potato skins, wheat middlings, Kellogg's cornflakes, and a popover left from Zuckerman's breakfast.
"Come on, pig,"
said Zuckerman, tapping the pail. Come, pig. And Wilbur took a step toward the pail. No, said the goose. "It's the old pail trick, Wilbur. Don't fall for it. He's trying to lure you back into captivity. He's appealing to your stomach." Wilbur didn't care. The food smelled appetizing, and he took another step towards the pail.
Pig,
said Zuckerman in a kind voice, and he began slowly walking toward the barnyard, looking all about him innocently, as if he didn't know what a little white pig was following along behind him. "You'll be sorry, called the goose. But Wilbur didn't care. He kept walking towards the pail of slops. "You'll miss your freedom, and our freedom's worth a barrel of slops." Wilbur didn't care. When Mr. Zuckerman reached the pig pen, he climbed over the fence and poured the slops in the trough, and then pulled the loose board away from the fence so that there was a wide hole for Wilbur to walk through. Reconsider, cried the goose. Wilbur paid no attention. He stepped through the fence to his yard, and he walked through the trough and took a long drink of those slops, sucking in the milk hungrily and chewing the popover. It was good to be home again. While Wilbur ate, Lurvy fetched a hammer and some 8-penny nails and nailed the board back in place. I don't think they want him to get out again. Then he and Mr. Zuckerman leaned lazily on the fence, and Mr. Zuckerman scratched Wilbur's back with the stick. "He's quite a pig," said Lurvy.
"Yes, he'll make a good pig," said Mr. Zuckerman.
Wilbur heard the words of praise, and he felt the pleasant rubbing of the stick along his back. He felt the warm milk inside of his stomach. This had been a tiring afternoon, and it was still only about 4 o'clock. But Wilbur was ready for bed.
"I'm really too young to go out in this world alone,"
he said as he lay down. So that is the end of chapter 3. Today we're going to read one more chapter together, and this chapter is called Loneliness. I want you to notice those little, those little marks right there. It looks like an I and a V. That's called Roman numerals, and that tells us what number it is. Those I's represent 1, 2, 3, 4. So if we look back at chapter 3, the escape, you'll notice there are 3 I's there, signifying the number 3. And that V, if it was by itself, would mean 5. But there's an I before the V, which actually means 5 minus 1. What's 5 minus 1? That's That's right, 4. So this is chapter 4, loneliness. The next day was rainy and dark. Rain fell on the roof of the barn and dripped steadily from the eaves. Rain fell in the barnyard and ran in crooked courses down the lane. Mrs. Zuckerman's kitchen windows came gushing out of the downspouts, and rain fell on the back of the sheep as they grazed in the meadow. Rain upset Wilbur's plans. Wilbur had planned to go out this day and dig a new hole in the garden. He had other plans, too. His plans for the day went something like this. Breakfast at 6:30, skim milk, crust, middlings, bits of donuts, wheat cakes, and drops of maple syrup sticking to them. Potato skins, leftover custard pudding with raisins, and bits of shredded wheat. Breakfast would be finished at 7. From 7 to 8, Wilbur planned to have a talk with Templeton, the rat that lived under his trough. Talking with Templeton was not the most interesting occupation in the world, but it was better than nothing. From 8 to 9, Wilbur planned to take a nap outdoors in the sun. And from 9 to 11, he planned to dig a hole or a trench or possibly find something good to eat behind the dirt. From 11 to 12, he planned to stand still and watch flies on the boards, watch bees in the clover, and watch swallows in the air. 12 o'clock, lunchtime. Middlings, warm apples, apple pears, meat gravy, carrot scrapings, meat scraps, stale almond, and the wrapper of a package of cheese. Lunch would be over at 1. From 1 to 2, Wilbur planned to sleep. From 2 to 3, he began to scratch itchy places from rubbing around the fence. And from 3 to 4, he planned to stand perfectly still and think of what it was like to be alive and wait for Fern. At 4 would come supper. Skim milk, provender leftover sandwich from Lurvy's lunchbox, prune skins, a morsel of this, a bit of that, fried potatoes, marmalade drippings, marmalade drippings. Little more of this, little more of that, piece of baked apple, scraps from an upside-down cake. Wilbur had gone to sleep thinking about these plans, and he woke at 6 and saw that it was raining, and it seemed as though he couldn't bear it.
I get everything all beautifully planned, and it's gotta go in rain.
For a while, he stood gloomily indoors, and then he walked through the door and looked out. Drops of rain struck his face. His yard was cold and wet, and Templeton was nowhere to be seen.
Are you out there, Templeton?
Called Wilbur. There was no answer, and suddenly Wilbur, he felt lonely and friendless.
Oh, one day just like another, he groaned. I'm very young. I have no real friends here in the barn. It's going to rain all morning and all afternoon, and Fern won't come in such bad weather. Oh, honestly.
And Wilbur was crying again, for the second time in 2 days. At 6:30, Wilbur heard the banging of a pail, and Lurvy was standing outside in the rain stirring up breakfast. Come on, pig, said Lurvy. Wilbur did not budge. Lurvy dumped the slops, scraped the pail, and walked away, and he noticed that something was wrong with the pig. Wilbur didn't want food. He wanted love. He wanted a friend, someone who would play with him. And he mentioned this to the goose, who was sitting quietly in a corner of the sheep field.
Will you come over and play with me?
He asked. Sorry, Sonny. Sorry, said the goose. I'm sitting on my eggs. 8 of them. Gotta keep them toasty warm. I have to stay right here. I'm no flibberty-ibberty gibbet. I do not play while those are eggs to hatch. I expect goslings. Well,
I didn't think you were expecting woodpeckers,
said Wilbur bitterly. Wilbur next tried one of the lambs.
Will you please play with me?
Certainly not, said a lamb. And for the first place, I cannot get into your pen, as I am not old enough to jump over the fence. And in the second place, I'm not interested in pigs. Pigs mean less than nothing to me. That does not sound like a kind person that I would like to play with. Walk on, sheep.
What do you mean less than nothing? Replied Wilbur. I don't think there's such thing as less than nothing. Nothing is absolutely the limit of nothingness. It's the lowest you can go. It's the end of the line. How can something be less than nothing? If there was something less than nothing, then nothing would be nothing. It wouldn't be something, even though it's just a very little bit of something. But nothing is nothing. Then nothing has nothing to do with less than it.
Oh, be quiet, said the lamb. Go play by yourself. I don't play with pigs. Sadly, Wilbur lay down and listened to the rain, and soon he saw a rat climbing down a slant board that he used to go up the stairway.
Will you play with me, Templeton?
Asked Wilbur. Play, said Templeton, twirling his whiskers. Play. I hardly know the meaning of the word.
Well, it means to have fun, to frolic, to run and skip and make merry.
I never do any of those things if I can avoid it, replied the rat sourly. I prefer to spend my time eating, gnawing, spiting, and hiding. I'm a glutton, but not a merrymaker. Right now I'm on my way to your trough to eat your breakfast, since you haven't got any sense to eat it yourself. And then Templeton, the rat, crept stealthily along the wall and disappeared into a private tunnel that he had dug between the door and the trough in Wilbur's yard. Templeton was a crafty rat, and he had pretty much things his own way. The tunnel was an example of his skill and cunning. The tunnel enabled him to get from the barn to his hiding place under the pig's trough without ever coming out into the open. He had tunnels and runways all over Mr. Zuckerman's farm and could get from one place to the other without being seen. Usually he slept during the daytime and was abroad only after dark. Why do you think that is? Why do you think he doesn't want to be seen and be around in the daytime and only comes out in the dark? I didn't think they were nocturnal, meaning that that's when they're awake and they're hiding. I wonder why rats don't want to come out during the day and want to hide from people. Let's read on to see if we can find out. Wilbur watched him disappear into his tunnel, and in a moment he saw the rat's sharp nose poke out from underneath the wooden trough. Cautiously, Templeton pulled himself up over the edge of the trough. This was almost more than Wilbur could stand. On this dreary, rainy day, to see his breakfast being eaten by somebody else. He knew Templeton was getting soaked out there in the pouring rain, but even that didn't comfort him. Friendless, dejected, hungry, he threw himself down in the manure and sobbed. Late that afternoon, Lurvy went to Mr. Zuckerman. "I think there's something wrong with that pig of yours. He hasn't touched his food."
"Give him 2 spoonfuls of sulfur and a little bit of molasses," said Mr. Zuckerman.
Wilbur couldn't believe what was happening to him when Lurvy caught him and forced the medicine down his throat. This was certainly the worst day of his life. He didn't know whether he could endure the awful loneliness anymore. Dark settled over everything. Soon there were only shadows and noises of the sheep chewing their curds, and occasionally the rattle of the cow chain up overhead. You can imagine Wilbur's surprise when out of the darkness came a voice he had never heard before. It sounded rather thin, but pleasant. "Do you want a friend, Wilbur?" it said. "I'll be a friend to you. I've been watching you all day, and I like you."
"But I can't see you," said Wilbur, jumping to his feet. "Where are you? And who are you?"
"I'm right up here," said the voice. "Go to sleep. You'll see me in the morning." Wow. That is a very interesting way to end this chapter. Chapter 4. So, since we've been focusing on the reading strategy of predictions today, I want you to predict, who is that voice going to be? And do you think that voice is going to be a good friend to Wilbur? What he really, really wants right now? Thank you so much for reading Charlotte's Web Part 2 with us, chapters 2 through 4, and focusing on the reading strategy of predictions, or taking a guess about what's going to happen next, using the information that we already know. So, till next time, thank you so much for sharing our love of reading together. We'll see you soon. Have a great day.